Last year, the Biden administration rolled out the most comprehensive climate bill in U.S. history and launched the journey of climate action that was promised during his campaign. But it is now evaluating the approval of an oil and gas drilling opportunity in Alaska called the Willow Project. You may not have heard of the project because it seems to have flown under the radar, but people are talking about it on, of all places, TikTok. In fact, my daughter is the person who told me about it. I want to find out more information about the project, so I reached out to my good friend and colleague Angelo Villagomez, and he put me in touch with Jenny Rowland Shea, who has been working on this project at the Center for American Progress for a while now. Jenny tells us about the history and the future plans of the project that I think you should know about, as well as how people in Alaska really feel about the Willow Project. We're going to talk about that on this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And normally on Wednesdays is all about speaking up for the ocean. It's all about how we talk about science communication. Last week we had Melissa Truth Miller on to talk about her sort of experience and how she does science communication. And this is really an example of science communication going right using social media. So the Willow Project is an oil and gas project that's going on. It's kind of flown under the radar, yet people are talking about it on TikTok, which of all places, it's probably one of the best places to go because the virality of shows or videos, the potential of that short content, that short, I think they call it not long-term content, not short-term content, short-form content. That's the key. Short-form content can go viral quite quickly on, and that's what's happened really with a lot of these projects. So I'm just looking at it from the Cancel the Willow Project account. This one had I gotta see how many views it had because it had quite a few. It had 9.1 million views as of this morning, which is the Tuesday before releasing this. Is March 7th. And that's huge because it's only been around, not for long, it's only been around for 5 days at this point. So the fact that people are talking about it is a great thing. There's a call to action to sign petitions. The closing of the public comments closed on March 6th. And so there's a lot of stuff that goes on before that. There's a lot of stuff that goes on after it. The decision is going to be made. Here's the interesting thing. I was looking on TikTok to look at some of the videos that came out. Of all things, a Fox News reporter asked the press secretary about, why is this, this Willow Project, is it going to be approved or it's, based on the campaign, based on the Biden administration's climate bill, the Willow Project's not going to be approved. It's just going to be dead in the water. And they basically said, well, we can have both. And then, the reporter rightly said, well, in 2019, Biden said in his campaign, we are going to end fossil fuels. So why is this project, which Jenny talks about in her interview that you're going to hear in a moment, why is this project that could be going on for 30 plus years and maybe the beginning of a larger project that, why is this going on? Why is this happening? And they didn't really have they didn't really have an answer for it. This is where the politics gets tricky. This is where people need to talk more about it so that politicians, the administrations, all listen to you, the people, to say, we do not want this project here. That's what they need to hear. That's what they need to be flooded. Their offices need to be flooded. Their emails, their social media accounts need to be flooded with saying, hey, we need to stop this project from happening. It's not good for the climate. It's not good for the people in Alaska or just the people around the world. And I asked Jenny to come on the podcast because she has a history with this project. She wrote an article, 4 reasons why the Willow Project is unfit for approval. She wrote that back in August of 2022. She talks about it in this interview. She talks a lot about the Willow Project and sort of how people feel about it, what the future is, everything like that. It's really interesting. I want you to listen. Here's the interview with Jenny Rowland Shea. Enjoy it, and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Jenny, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about the very important issue of the Willow Project?
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Right on. This is, I think this is a really important episode to have on the podcast. I'm really happy that you're here. This is a project that I heard about through actually my daughter, who found it on a TikTok video, somebody talking about it, believe it or not. And she kind of shared it with me, shared an article. And it just seemed like the article was a little too for the Willow Project. It's a fossil fuel project, an oil drilling project on the northern slope of Alaska. We'll get more information in just a second. It concerned me because I know how controversial this area is, how people have tried to do it in the past, drill in the past, and it's been kind of, stopped a lot of times. It's always an issue, just with local people, just with climate change and everything. And it looks like the government, like the U.S. government, the Biden administration, is looking like this project will try and go through. They kind of looks like they try to slip it under the radar. It wasn't a big issue until I started to hear about it. For me anyway, I didn't really see it on a lot of news agencies. But it's something that we need to talk about. And Jenny, I reached out to a friend of mine, Angelo, who works for the Center of American Progress, and he mentioned that you are very much looking after this file. And so he suggested, hey, you should have Jenny on the podcast. You are so kind to accept so last minute, so I appreciate it. And you're here to talk about it. So, Jenny, before we get into the Willow Project, can you just let us know a little bit about you and who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I am Jenny Rowland Shea, and I am the Director of Public Lands at the Center for American Progress. And so that means basically that I work on land conservation issues as well as kind of oil and gas and other energy development on public land. Public land is just, what we all own as being U.S. citizens. So it is our national parks, our wildlife refuges, Bureau of Land Management managed lands, and all of the kind of natural areas that the federal government manages for different purposes, including protection and use for resources.
Okay, great. Now, to get in a position like this, how did this all end up? Like, what did you go to school for? Was this always in the plan for you as a career? Can you just talk a little bit about your journey and how you ended up at Center of American Progress?
Yeah, sure. I did my schooling in geography, actually, and came to DC to get my master's degree in geography at George Washington, where I studied basically urban sustainability planning. And from there, got kind of the policy itch from being in DC and worked at National Wildlife Federation for a little while, and then moved on to CAP, where I kind of entered the public lands world and have now been doing this for around 7 years, working on primarily federal policy, but also occasionally state, local policy, anything having to do with kind of the natural world and its connection to policy.
Okay, and then like the Center of American Progress, I believe it's a nonprofit organization, and so as part of that, how do you are you trying to influence policy, or are you trying to make people aware of specific policies? What's the role for CAP in this particular instance, or in sort of your particular instance?
Yeah, so CAP is a nonprofit. It's kind of also a think tank, and so part of what we do is we try and influence policy to build a more progressive future. We think that, there are a lot of reasons conservation is great, and we like to figure out what are the policies to help do more of that, to protect more places, to have conservation management, be better working, to get more funding. And so part of that is policy kind of development. And then the other piece is policy advocacy. And so that is like getting our policymakers to do, in our view, what the right thing is, and make some of these choices that will help us have a better world.
So a lot of the times, especially in this case with the Willow Project, a lot of the times, are you sort of searching on some of the big issues on public lands? Like, so you're you're creating relationships or maintaining, because you've been in this role for 7 years. So I'm assuming you've built a lot of the relationships, but you're maintaining relationships with a lot of people who work within government, outside of government, other nonprofits, maybe private industries, to find out what's going on. And then when a project like this comes to boot, you make people aware of what's happening and sort of where the I guess you're more of the voice for conservation or for the public lands, or also for the people as well, maybe? Am I correct in assuming that?
Yeah, definitely. So I have a lot of relationships with, different groups that work in conservation as well as groups that work in government. And, one piece of it is that government can move slowly, and especially when we have administration changes. So a lot of these issues are not new. They circle back around again until something is actually
Right.
finally decided. And that's, the case here. But during that time, we are in contact with various groups, and definitely are kind of aiming to speak on the side of public lands and the environment, but also, the people. Ultimately, that is why we want to preserve public lands, and the
Mhm.
environment in general, is because people benefit from it. And so we're also, in contact with, we're based in Washington, D.C., but in contact with people on the ground who, live in Alaska and live in the North Slope. And so that's kind of how we work on these issues, and translate what's happening on the ground to the decision makers who are in Washington, D.C.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. So we're here to talk about the Willow Project. So and I want to dive in more into your background because I think it's so fascinating of how you got here. But I really want to. We'll do that another time. We'll have you back because I want to dive into what you've done, and other things that you've worked on. But this is such an important project. The Willow Project, can you give us a sort of a little bit of a background? I know you've been working on this for quite some time. This is not a project that's just popped up, like I mentioned. It just popped up to me, but it's, I live in Canada. We can't find out everything at all times, but this seems to be a project that's been going on for quite some time. Can you just kind of give us a brief history of sort of how it came about and what's happening right now?
Yeah, and definitely this has been a little bit under the radar up until recently, when it's kind of exploded on TikTok, honestly, in the past couple of weeks, and social media. So in my view,
Wow.
this issue is getting the attention that it kind of has deserved for a long time. So really coming down to the wire when some of the final decisions are being made. But I think it's a great thing that people are becoming aware of this issue. But yeah, just to kind of set the stage, the place that we're talking about is in the Western Arctic, in the North Slope. It is called the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, which does not mean necessarily that it is just a reserve for oil and gas and oil and gas leasing. It is our largest piece in the U.S., our largest piece of public lands. And so it is managed for all kinds of resources, including really important, like calving grounds for caribou, all kinds of migratory birds and different wildlife, and as well as some oil and gas development as well. But actually, up until recently, there has not been a ton of oil and gas development in this area. It has just been kind of set aside. But ConocoPhillips bought a lease in the Western Arctic to develop for oil and gas, uh, and it is called the Willow Project, and they have applied to kind of develop that lease with the federal government, and that's the proposal that we're talking about right now. That proposal is for a really giant project. We're talking about numerous
Mm.
different well pads. We're talking about over 200 wells, uh, ice roads, a bunch of infrastructure that was not previously there, um, bulldozers needing to kind of thump around on the ice and look for polar bears. Um, and we're talking about a huge carbon potential coming from this, really like a carbon bomb. Many people have referred to it as. Um,
Right.
and because it would be almost 30 years of drilling, which is not how we a lot of us in the environmental community have seen how the future should go when we're talking about climate change, especially in the Arctic, which is warming 4 times as fast as the rest of the U.S. So this is the Massive Willow Project. The other kind of thing that it's pretty famous for is that it would require um, chilling of the ground. So they have to actually refreeze the permafrost in order to drill for oil. And we know all of this because ConocoPhillips has put that in their plan to do that. But This plan was initially approved under the Trump administration and then kicked back from the courts for not properly accounting for climate change and some endangered species issues. And then most recently, the Biden administration has been moving it forward. Just about a month ago, they put out the final environmental impact statement that kind of said that they were moving forward with approving the project. And now we're in the final days of that. This is the last day of the official comment period. That doesn't mean there's not still an open communication. If you want to tell Biden not to approve this project, there are plenty of ways to do that. But we are in the final stretch, and any day now, the Biden administration can make their final call on what happens with this project.
It's a really interesting predicament here because, before the Biden administration came through, and if this Willow Project was going to be approved, you would think it was going to be approved because the Trump administration was very pro fossil fuel, pro oil and gas and coal, of course, we know that. But when the Biden administration came through, Joe Biden and the entire administration, a lot of the Democrats have, campaigned on, climate change reduction and doing something to reduce climate change and reducing fossil fuel drilling and fossil fuel usage and so forth. And then even just, I believe it was just the beginning of last year in 2022, the Biden administration released their big climate program where there were a number of sort of bills and a number of, I guess, initiatives and regulations that were coming out to limit the amount of fossil fuels and really put more investment into renewable energy. That was applauded by a lot of environmentalists, a lot of, I guess, cautiously optimistic sort of applauses, in case of government in doing this type of work. But this is what they campaigned on. So we expected to see this. However, now we're seeing, this kind of sliding through, as you mentioned, under the radar. Why is this happening now? And how come the Biden administration is not saying, hey, we, I know you can't necessarily speak for them, but like they've pretty much kind of slid in and said, yeah, we're kind of going to let this through without really saying much. And hopefully nobody noticed. Do you think that's what they're trying to do?
Yes, that is what makes this all the more disappointing. Is the Biden administration has been one of the most progressive administrations we've had so far on climate change. They really put it into their campaign. They have put out multiple, orders acting on it. They just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is one of the biggest climate spending bills in history. So they're really making all of this progress. And then at the same time, here's the Willow Project that they're on track to approve. And that is standing in direct conflict with their climate obligations, as well as, the subsistence and wildlife values of the Western Arctic. So yeah, it is disappointing. And I certainly can't speak for them. It is a little bit unclear why they're moving forward with this. I think it is so far against some of the goals they've set for themselves that they're really, for lack of a better phrase, like shooting themselves in the foot in order to achieve their climate goals, because this is going to set them backwards in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And with the Willow Project in particular, it's kind of hard to put the genie back in the box. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the first big oil projects that would happen in the Western Arctic. And so it's putting in place all of this infrastructure that allows other oil companies or even ConocoPhillips themselves to build off of that infrastructure and more easily have new and additional projects. ConocoPhillips themselves has already, told their investors that that Willow is really just the beginning of what they want to do in this area, and that they have plans for, many more projects that would build off of it. But Willow is really the center of that, and everything spiders out from that.
It's really interesting how, we see these and we always talk about, people are saying, it's just one project. And as you mentioned, it's a project that could start, exploration in other places or start more projects. That's the danger of these types of projects. A lot of the times we've been sort of hoodwinked into saying, okay, well, maybe one more project. We still need fossil fuels. We still need drilling. So we'll just let this project go. And then next thing you know, more projects are put on proposals, and they're saying, well, because we already put this project through, let's do this one here. It makes a lot more sense. And then you almost get stuck in a vicious cycle of approving more and more projects. These companies are doing this. They've been doing this for a long time, and they know how to get away with this kind of work. But you almost think that the governments know this. You'd almost think that the Biden administration is sort of aware of this, and they would stop this from happening just at the inception. Have you heard anything from any of the people in Congress or the Senate, or even the Biden administration that are against this type of work happening?
So there definitely are people in Congress who are against this work, not the Alaska delegation. It's very complicated. In Alaska, in particular, their economy is wholly dependent on oil and gas revenues. And, none of their leaders have so far shown that leadership to start the process of transition and figure out what Alaska's long-term strategy is to keep their economy afloat. So that's one kind of issue that needs to be combated here as well. But I think just recently there was a letter from the ranking member, Grijalva, of the House Natural Resources Committee that had, I believe, around 15 members of Congress signed on, or members of the House signed on, opposing this project and basically telling the Biden administration this is not in line with your climate goals. And also the native village of Nuiqsut has, in the past couple of weeks, really made their voice heard that they're not okay with this project, and that they have a lot of concerns. It would really box them in to be surrounded on all sides by oil development. And they've had a few scares with air pollution that they're concerned about, and subsistence hunting issues with some of the caribou in this area. And so those are the primary reasons that some of the members of Congress have said to the Biden administration in recent days, like, what's going on? This is not the project. Don't do this. This isn't part of your climate legacy.
And have we heard a response from the administration on this type of sort of feedback?
The administration's been pretty quiet on this issue. I think it's a decision they don't want to have to make, but they obviously do have to make it. And so they've been pretty quiet. They put out the final environmental impact statement, the final environmental review about a month ago, and they put out a statement that was a little bit different from any kind of political statement for an issue like this that I've ever seen before. It kind of acknowledged that they were moving the project forward, but also still voiced concerns that they have with the project. And so there's been a lot of discussion kind of in the media of how much of the project they will move forward, if they will limit it in scope in some way. But, at the end of the day, any of these kind of quote unquote smaller proposals all result in almost the same amount of carbon pollution, and they don't have much difference in terms of impact on the environment. And so, approval in any sense is really just allowing this project to go forward and all of the consequences that come with that. So it's not really an argument of size. It's whether or not it happens.
And that's the thing too. Like in August, you wrote an article on the CAP's website talking about sort of the 4 things that could happen that is a good reason for this project not to go forth. You talked about how the Willow Project is a climate disaster in waiting. We just kind of talked about it there. The full scale of the project is not fully accounted for in the initial proposal. That the project must account for the risk of gas leaks. And then, of course, it appears that the ConocoPhillips has had a pretty influential part of the review process. I kind of want to just summarize, Bo. I know that the article's there, and I'll link to the show notes, but I just want to summarize how could for those of people who are like, well, we still need energy, we still need fossil fuels, how could Willow be that climate disaster? What could go wrong on some of these projects that people who don't know about these projects, would be surprised to hear?
Yeah. Well, so I would say one, Willow's a climate disaster if it goes right. I mean, it is intended to produce oil, which is causing climate change. But plenty of things can go wrong too. I think the things that are most at risk are the sensitive Arctic environment. So we're thinking about animals like polar bears and like caribou. Caribou in particular are a subsistence animal that many of the native villages and tribes and people rely on for food. Not many people, including myself, have ever been to the North Slope of Alaska, but there is not just like a grocery store. And so when people rely on this food, like caribou, it's not something that can easily be replaced. I think the environmental assessment, the government's environmental assessment estimated that it's like an order of magnitude of millions of dollars to replace the food source of caribou for the people who live there. And so that is one piece that's really at risk. And then, as you mentioned, the gas leaks issue, ConocoPhillips operates another nearby kind of oil pad that's on state of Alaska land that had a leak recently. And they sent home a bunch of workers, did not communicate things properly with the native village or the city of Nuiqsut. And so it has a lot of people really scared that there are these major air pollution events that can happen. And that one, they're still trying to get to the bottom of exactly what happened. But it seems part of it was that a piece failed because of melting permafrost, that a pipe basically moved or something like that because, the ground is not as frozen as it should be because of climate change. And that's a real risk with Willow, too. We know that they'll be using chillers to freeze the ground. And so Alaska is getting warmer, and that's making oil and gas development more dangerous. And then the other thing that I just add that I don't think a lot of people know, a lot of people think with this project, like, oh, well, and one reason the Biden administration might, be thinking this too is gas prices were really high late last year, middle of last year. They still are in a lot of places. People might be thinking like, well, we need oil right now because, we're still in the process of this energy transition. But the Willow Project, the fastest it can go is it's not going to get oil online until 6 or 7 years from now. And that's at the fastest rate. So that's not solving gas prices right now at all. It's not solving our energy crisis right now either. So it's not solving anything right now. It's 10 years down the line, and then we're looking at a 30-year project. We're talking about 2050, 2060. So I think people need to be asking themselves, like, do we want to have a project? Do we need this much oil and gas in risky places like the Arctic in 2060? And the answer is probably no, that we need to be working on this transition now, not investing in these kind of older, energy systems of the past, or what should be energy systems of the past, especially when they're in such risky areas like the Northern Arctic. There are other places to do oil and gas development, frankly, that are not so severe.
I agree with you. I think we're past the point of long-term oil and gas projects. I almost feel like those long-term projects that are going on now should start to be wrapping up, in terms of moving on and to the energy. And to be honest, I don't know enough of how much we should be depending on fossil fuels compared to renewables and things like that. I don't have that information at hand. I wish I did. I wish more people did. And so to see where we are with the dependence on fossil fuels compared to other renewables and so forth. And so I can understand some projects going on. This one, makes me worried because it seems like you said, it's gonna go on for a number of years. It's not just like a 5-year project. This looks like it's going to be built into a larger a larger project. And then you talk about how it's going to affect sort of local indigenous groups that look for subsistence hunting. Polar bears are obviously already at risk due to climate change. This disturbance is not going to help in any way in Alaska. So it'll definitely have a part here to play in their overall risk. What's interesting though too is I read an article on CBC, which is sort of like the NPR or the NPR or government sort of news agency for Canada, CBC, and it had a lot of people that showed support for the project. It had some Alaskan senators, and then it also had some local indigenous councils that had it. And I can't remember offhand which council it was, and that really got me thinking: is that real? Is that the true feeling of the people who live up there? So that's when I reached out to Angelo and he put me in touch with you. So this is what really gets me in these types of situations is from the relationship that you have built and that CAP have built and other organizations. What are the feelings of the people who are up there in Alaska, in the North Slope area? Some of them are probably dependent on the caribou. Some of them are probably dependent on maybe the jobs that'll come from oil and gas. What are the overall sort of thoughts of the people who live up there on this project?
Yeah, so it's complicated. It's not an easy black and white issue. In Alaska, as I mentioned, a lot of people are dependent on oil and gas. A lot of these really remote communities actually rely on corporations like ConocoPhillips to provide some basic infrastructure in their communities. That said, the most local people would be the city and native village of Nuiqsut. That is kind of the closest town to where the Willow Project would be. And they recently wrote a letter to the president and the rest of the Biden administration, asking them not to go forward with what they have currently mapped out, that they have concerns with the gas leaks, that they have concerns with how the environmental review was done, with how caribou will be impacted. And so, the hyper local aspect of it when you're looking at Nuiqsut is that they have made pretty clear that they don't want this to go forward, and that at the very least it needs more time. Some of the public comment periods have been during hunting seasons when people haven't been able to, give their comments, and so I think at the very least this has felt rushed to those people, and that there needs to be more analysis done. The other folks, it is more complicated when you talk about Alaska more broadly. The senators and member of Congress are in support of this project, but it's a controversial topic in Alaska for sure. There are Alaskans on both sides of this, and I think it's hard when your economy is so hyper focused on one sector, that without doing that kind of bigger thinking on how do you long term save your economy, because we know that it can't be oil and gas forever, and especially when climate change is really devastating Alaska as well. So trying to figure that all out is a much bigger question than just Willow, but it definitely plays into this, as does, the issue of climate change. And a lot of people in Alaska know that they have to act on climate change to save where they live.
Yeah, it's interesting how, a lot of the places in the Arctic and Canada as well rely on oil and gas. However, they're the first to really feel the consequences of, burning fossil fuels and drilling for fossil fuels and using those with, loss of ice and warming and so forth. It's definitely had an effect on the livelihoods up there, good and bad in certain situations, depending on where you're working or not working. And obviously the indigenous communities up there, definitely have a connection to the nature of Alaska and to the environment of Alaska, and it impacts their culture, it impacts their ways, and so that needs to be taken into account. So I guess, the comment period is complete as of today, and decisions can really be made at any point in time. You mentioned earlier, Jenny, when we weren't recording, we were just kind of chatting about this project. For nonprofit organizations, a lot of the work is the work done now, or for you guys, are you still working with, the Alaskan state government? Are you working with the federal government to try and influence and try and show the policies and sort of the initiatives that this project goes against, and starting a project like this goes against? Are you still doing that type of work, or is this just more of a hold your breath and wait for the decision at this point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, one, it's not hold your breath and wait. It's not final until it's final, even though the official kind of comment period is over where you can submit through the official channels. That does not mean that the Biden administration can't hear you. I think we started off by saying that this has really kind of exploded on social media and TikTok. That does not go unnoticed. This is trending right now, I think, just below Justin Bieber, which I'm not on TikTok, but I think that says something. And so it's not being ignored. I think there is a loud enough voice that it is still kind of should be being considered. And so that's what I would say until there is a final decision. In terms of what CAP is doing, we want to, if this is approved, we do want to think long term, and like how, there's a scenario where this is not going to be the last of these projects. There's going to be the next Willow. There's already one called Peregrine that's in the work. The project plan is in the works. It's going to be submitted for approval soon. And so, we know this is not going to be the last one of these decisions that we have to make in the Arctic. And so what kind of policies do we need to put in place to make this decision making less one-off? If we have a climate plan for the US, how do we make sure that oil and gas decisions are put into that plan from the get-go? Because right now, the climate plan does not seem to include federal oil and gas decisions. And so President Biden needs to really incorporate that into his climate plan. And I think that's the real question of like, how do we make sure that our climate plan incorporates these decisions ahead of time so that we're not forced with fighting every single one of these one-off projects, but that there is actually a plan for how to transition.
So yeah, you're right. I completely agree. Looking forward, it's interesting how, the federal decisions on oil and gas is not necessarily included in the climate plan. And I think it's really interesting. We talked on this podcast, we talk a lot about marine spatial planning and so when we talk about oceans, we, just like we do on land, we have areas that we protect for parks. We have areas that we develop for residential areas, for commercial areas, for some type of usage. And it seems as though a climate plan should be installed to overtop all of those other plans, whether it be on land, whether it be in the ocean, just so that decision, like climate, is always included in on the decisions. And it sounds like even though the climate plan was put out last year, it sounds like there still needs to be some improvement made in terms of how decisions are made going into the future. And I think with a lot of these plans, we don't see that until these types of decisions come up and we realize, oh, wait a minute, there's a loophole in here, and we need to kind of plug this loophole up to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So I think that's really important to move on with and into the future. And I guess that's the role that the Center of American Progress and your colleagues make, in terms of let's make sure that these policies are addressed and these decisions are included in the climate plan. So we can't just have a one-off going against everything that we've built, and put in hard work for, so that these projects don't just kind of slip under or slip through a loophole. So I like the fact that, there's a plan going forward regardless of the decision, hopefully the decision comes out in favor of the environment and for the people of Alaska. What can people do? We talked a little bit about how this project came up was on TikTok, so people can talk about it more. Is that sort of what you would suggest, for now, is can people continue to talk to it, whether it be on social media, TikTok, Instagram, that kind of stuff, in these short form videos, long form videos, podcast episodes? Is that sort of the goal that you encourage people to do, is to just make more and more people aware of this project and sort of the factors that can lead towards potential disaster or potential exacerbation of climate problems? Is that what you recommend?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, to continue to talk about and, spread awareness about this issue. And then, long term, I think it's important to continue to, call on the Biden administration to take its climate pledge seriously and to incorporate it into all of the different federal decisions that the government makes.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. So Jenny, this has been great. Now we know what we can do. We know what the nonprofit organizations are doing. We'll keep everybody updated on what's happening and maybe next steps. Maybe we can have you come on later on and talk about the next steps of what's going to happen in the future. But I want to thank you so much for joining us today, providing this information to us, and being able so that we can talk about it more, and telling, kind of reaffirming that talking about this on social media to our friends and family really helps, and it can help change people's decisions. So I truly, truly believe that. So I want to thank you again for coming on. Thank you for all the work you've provided in making us all aware of this project, and the work you've provided on the policy, you and your colleagues and CAP and all the other nonprofit organizations and government, non-government organizations that are doing this. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, and we'd love to have you back to get an update.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jenny, for joining us on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Really appreciate you providing us with a lot of knowledge about the project. I always find when I read information about the project, especially from sort of the mainstream media type places like CBC, where I get my news from here in Canada, I always ask questions. I always wonder, they're asking, in this article, they were asking certain people how they felt about it. Inupiat councils, which is local Indigenous council, they were asking senators, and everybody seemed for the project, which surprised me. It doesn't always seem that way. My history in working in sort of policy, working around oceans, obviously this is not necessarily oceans, it has to do on land. It always gets me because it's not always the case. It's not always rainbows and roses. It's a lot of times there are people there who are concerned about health, concerned about safety, concerned about what's happening to their ground. In this case, Jenny alluded to a lot of permafrost issues. The fact that to be able to drill, they have to refreeze the permafrost. To be able to drill, they have to put in ice roads. They have to build infrastructure, which could be good and bad in the eyes of local people. I have no idea. It all depends on how they see the project. But then you're looking at air quality problems, and if we're not getting the full picture of the full representation of people who are there, that's a concern. So I'm really happy that Jenny was able to provide some of that information to us. I think it's really important that we discuss that more. And so I'm glad we were able to get this out. I want people to realize the call to action here is to continue to talk about it. Talk about it on social media. Talk about it to your local politicians. Talk about it on TikTok. Comment on these posts that other people are making. Sign petitions. Flood, like I said at the beginning of the episode, flood emails, flood the social media accounts of politicians to say, hey, you're representing us. We want this to happen, or we don't want this to happen. Please listen to us, and this is where the decisions get influenced. And, to think about the fact that we are at a place where most countries in the world are moving towards a non-fossil fuel based economy, or trying to move that. And then, and then you have a country like the US saying, we're going to stop this kind of stuff. We're going to put the most comprehensive climate bill in place. Well, that needs to be shown. We need to see action. Once you put those laws in place and those bills in place, you need to show action. You need to show that you're being a part of this. And there's always loopholes. There's always decisions that need to be made. And this is where we hold those governments accountable. Not just the U.S., Canada, everywhere. We need to hold more governments accountable for the decision they make, because one of the reasons why the Biden administration got elected for a lot of people was because of the action he promised on climate. So we need to make sure that we hold them to that and hold them accountable for that. So I want to thank you for listening to this episode. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. You can DM me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. We also have a TikTok account at How to Protect the Ocean. You can also email me if you go to speakupforblue.com. Just go to the Contact Us page. That email, if you fill out the form, that goes right to my email for Speak Up for Blue, and I will answer you. And other than that, I want to thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of How to Protect the Ocean. This has been a really important episode. I'm glad we're getting to sort of the meat and potatoes of things and getting out all the information that we can. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well, just on the episodes that we've been providing lately. So thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. We really appreciate it. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.